What's up, party people? This is chapter 3 of Mario Tronti's Marx, Labor Power, Working Class. Chapter 3 is titled Critique of Ideology. So let's rock and roll. But we are getting ahead of ourselves here. These are problems in Marx, in the advanced mature phase of Marx's thought. We have to take the proper path to arrive at these conclusions. This path is itself important, because this path wipes the slate of the old problems and poses the new problems. Let's turn, for example, to look at Marx coming to grips with the critique of ideology, and we will say, a little bit arbitrarily, comes to grips with the critique of communism and socialism. Here, naturally, we are referring to his critique of pre-Marxist communism and socialism, but anyone can see that after Marx, these ideologies did not much change. Marx's 1844 manuscript on private property and communism does contain a critique of private property from the perspective of communism, but also, and together with this, contains a critique of communism from the perspective of private property. This last point has not been properly brought into relief. On the one hand, Marx tells us there is labor, the subjective essence of private property, qua exclusion from property. On the other hand, there is capital, objective labor, qua exclusion from labor. Together they make up, quote, private property. As private properties develop state of contradiction, hence a dynamic relationship driving towards resolution. End quote. Marx. First, private property was considered only in terms of private property's objective aspect, but still also with labor as private property's subjective essence. It thus exists in the form of capital which, as such, als solches, or solches, I don't know how to say it, solchees, and parenthesis, is to be suppressed. That is what Broder says. Or else a particular mode of labor, for instance, an agricultural labor. Sorry, 1 second. Or else a particular mode of labor, for instance, an agricultural labor, leveled down, parcelized, and unfree, is considered the cause of the harmful character of private property and its alienated existence from humanity. This is what Fourier says. Or industrial labor is considered the decisive thing, and this shall lead to the exclusive predominance of industrialists and improvements of the laborers' conditions. This is what Saint-Simon says. And finally comes communism, which is, quote, the positive expression of annulled private property. At first, as universal private property, bracket, das allgemeine Privateigentum, end bracket, end quote, Marx. Insofar as it embraces the relation of private property as a whole, it is, quote, in its first form only a generalization, end quote. Bracket, Verallgemeinerung, end bracket, Endconsummation, bracket, Vollendung, end bracket, of it, bracket, of this relation, end bracket, end quote. Marx. The domination of the property of things presents itself at this point so vast as to be bent on canceling out everything that cannot be possessed by all as private property. Quote, the category of the worker is not done away with, but extended to all men, end quote. The relationship of private property remains the community's relationship to the world of things. Quote, the community is only a community of labor and equality of wages paid out by communal capital by the community as the universal capitalist. Both sides of a relationship are raised to an imagined universality. Labor as the category in which every person is placed, and capital as the acknowledged universality and power of the community. End quote. Marx. This first positive suppression of private property, this quote, crude communism, ... is thus merely a manifestation of the vileness of private property, which wants to set itself up as the positive community system. End quote. Marx. Assuming historical forms counterposed to private property, communism seeks historical proof for communism's self, a proof in the existent, picking out single moments from the overall movement and pinning them down as proof of communism's own historical reality. Quote, by so doing, communism simply makes clear that by far the greater part of this process contradicts communism's own claim. That, if it has ever existed, precisely its being in the past refused its pretension to reality. End quote. Marx. There were indeed good reasons why communism immediately coincided with atheism. Just look at Owen. It is true that atheist philanthropy is from the outset only an abstract philosophical philanthropy, while communism's philanthropy is from the outset real and immediately tends towards action. But there remained a substantial affinity between atheism and communism in both method and content. In its attempts to affirm the essentiality of nature and of humanity, atheism is the negation of God, and atheism presents humanity's existence by way of this same negation. Socialism as such no longer needs this mediation. Socialism, quote, proceeds from the theoretically and practically sensuous consciousness of man and of nature as the essence, end quote. Marx. It is humanity's positive consciousness of itself, no longer mediated by the suppression of religion. Quote, man's positive self-consciousness, no longer mediated through the abolition of religion, just as real life is man's positive reality, no longer mediated through the abolition of private property, through communism, end quote. Marx. For its part, quote, communism is the position as the negation of the negation, and is hence the actual phase necessary for the next stage of historical development in the process of human emancipation and rehabilitation. Communism is the necessary form and the dynamic principle of the immediate future, but communism as such is not the goal of human development, the form of human society, end quote. Marx. Here Marx seems to place communism in a subordinate position relative to socialism. Marx practically sets communism on the same footing as atheism. Communism is posed as a negation of the negation, rather than as an immediate positive affirmation. Communism is reduced to being a means, an instrument, a real and necessary moment for arriving at socialism. This is communism, then, as a negation of the present, as an instrument of struggle against the present, and not yet as an affirmation of a future state of affairs. Communism as a transitional phase within capitalism. This is no paradox. If we think that just a few years later Marx himself would reduce communism to the Communist Party, capital C, capital P, quote, bracket, meeting the bracket, nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself, end quote. Marx. Moreover, even in the German ideology, Marx had said, quote, communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality, bracket, will and bracket, have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things, end quote. German ideology. But nor is it a paradox even if we think of the development of the objective structures of capitalist society, which sees in community capital, in the community as general capitalist and as generalization of wage labor, a highly developed form of capital's socialized existence. In critical utopian communism, the infant working class expressed the principles the working class had drawn from 1789, the year of the French Revolution, and according to Marx, in a rather hapless fashion. The first formless masses of proletarians felt that they needed real equality in order to establish their own power, to build their own society. It is this that revealed to the first capitalist thought capitalist production's unavoidable need for formal equality. It is not true that communist social egalitarianism is an illegitimate extension of bourgeois political egalitarianism. The opposite is true. Bourgeois political egalitarianism is the first concrete historical realization of eternal ideas on leveling linked to the eternally misery-stricken layers of the toiling population. In the manifesto, Marx said of the utopian socialists and communists that, quote, only from the point of view of being the most suffering class does the proletariat exist for them, end quote. Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. This left them unable to find the material conditions. This left the who? Utopian socialists and communists unable to find the material conditions for the proletariat's emancipation. Instead of the gradual self-organization of the proletariat as a class, the utopian socialists and communists proposed a form of social organization that would spring from a blueprint. Quote, they, the utopian socialists and communists, want to improve the condition of every member of society. Hence, the utopian socialists and communists habitually appeal to society at large without distinction of class, nay, by preference to the ruling class. ... Hence, the utopian communists and socialists reject all political and especially all revolutionary action. The utopian socialists and communists wish to attain their ends by peaceful means and endeavor by small experiments necessarily doomed to failure, and by the force of example to pave the way for the new social gospel, end quote. Communist Manifesto. Everyone knows that this critical utopian form of the first communism, knocked down by Marx, did not then disappear. Rather, this critical utopian form of the first communism grew and developed to becoming dominant precisely in the so-called Marxist current of the workers' movement. And since it is this current, the Marxist current of the workers' movement, that has set itself the goal of socialism in the most practical terms, the result has been the following curious yet logically consistent conclusion. Critical utopian communism has become the ideology of practical socialism. Thus, the scientific working class perspective and Marx's analysis on capitalist society have everywhere been replaced by a resounding, quote, return to ideology, end quote. Likewise, the whole organized workers' movement lives a pre-Marxist existence. The clash, a historically recent clash, between Marxism and communism, between science and ideology, between theory and propaganda, which, from the working class point of view, found its greatest representative in Lenin, concluded, for well-determined material reasons, with the opportunistic synthesis of a, quote, ideological, end quote, science, a, quote, propagandistic, end quote, theory, even to the point that the working class, which had together with Marx criticized the ideologies of capital, is today obliged to criticize the working class's own ideology, and again to do so together with Marx. We do not know yet whether this critique will only partly or wholly concern Marx's own work, But what we do already know is that, as a scientific self-critique from the working class point of view, it will coincide with the historical experience of a concrete revolutionary process. Nonetheless, the real starting point again seems to be to reduce communism to a party. Practice again seems to impose the temporary solution of seeing it as a simple instrument of struggle within capital. Never must it instead be seen as an endpoint in the evolution of the organization, as a, quote, form of the Workers' Party. It seems that the only page left to us of Marx's draft for the manifesto was written more for yesterday's capitalists than for today's reformists. It concludes, quote, "The communists do not push forward any new theory of property. The communists state a fact. You deny the most striking facts. You have to deny them. You're backward-looking utopians," end quote. Communist Manifesto. The rejection of the concept labor value is the starting point of the Marxian critique of, quote, socialism, end quote. For Marx, this critique was already finished business in his 1847 Poverty of Philosophy. Proudhon's fundamental error was that Proudhon confused the quantity and value of labor as if they were one identical measure for the value of commodities. If that were so, then the relative value of any commodity could be measured without regard for the quantity of labor contained within that commodity. The quantity of labor that it could purchase, or the quantity of labor that could purchase it. But that is not how things are. The value of labor cannot serve as a measure of value any more than the value of any other commodity can. A relative value cannot be determined by a relative value, which in turn needs to be determined. Again, this error is rooted in the logical conflict between Adam Smith's two concepts of value, embodied labor and commanded labor, though they are no longer counterposed but identified outright. Ricardo, who had already unveiled this error, was reinterpreted by Smith, the, quote, egalitarian, end quote. Consequences of Ricardo's theory of value were similarly re-explained. Marx speaks of how, quote, "It is in order to find the proper proportions in which workers would share in the products, or in other words, to determine the relative value of labor, that M. Proudhon seeks a measure of the relative value of commodities," end quote. Marx, Poverty of Philosophy. In order to achieve this, he found nothing better than giving, as the equivalent of a certain quantity of labor, the same products that it created. The wage thus becomes the true value of labor, quote, "which is as good as supposing that the whole of society consists merely of immediate workers who receive their own produce as wages," end quote. Poverty of Philosophy. This is the egalitarian application of the Ricardian theory, which almost all British socialists have proposed in various areas even prior to Proudhon. For example, Marx cites communist J.F. Bray's 1839 book, Labor's Wrongs and Labor's Remedy. Quote, "Men have only two things which they can exchange with each other, namely labor and the produce of labor, ... If a just system of exchanges were acted upon, the value of all articles would be determined by the entire cost of production, and equal values would always exchange for equal values," end quote. J.F. Bray. "We would thus arrive at a joint stock company made up of an infinite number of smaller joint stock companies, all of which work, produce, and exchange their products on the basis of the most perfect equality." Quote, "The joint stock modification, which is nothing but a concession to present-day society in order to obtain communism, in parentheses, by being so constituted as to admit of individual property and production in connection with a common property in the productive powers, making every individual dependent on the individual's own exertions, and at the same time allowing him an equal participation in every advantage afforded by nature and art, end quote. Marx. So, Marx comments, at root there is not the exchange of products, but the exchange of the workers who combine in production. An hour of labor is exchanged for an hour of labor, the fundamental axiom from which everything starts. But what remains to be established is the peculiarity, insignificant for the communist J.F. Bray's socialism, of the mode of this exchange. From the moment in which social labor begins to be exchanged on an individual basis, the mode of exchange of the productive forces determines the mode of exchange of products. Individual exchange thus already corresponds to a determinate system of associated production, and this we have seen as nothing other than the product of the antagonism between two classes. On this basis, therefore, there cannot be individual exchange without class struggle. All the honest bourgeois consciences refuse to accept this self-evident fact. Quote, Mr. Bray turns the illusion of the respectable bourgeois into an ideal Mr. Bray would like to attain. In a purified individual exchange, freed from all the elements of antagonism Mr. Bray finds in it, Mr. Bray sees a, quote, equalitarian, end quote, relation which you would like society to adopt. Mr. Bray does not see that this equalitarian relation, this corrective ideal that Mr. Bray would like to apply to the world, is itself nothing but the reflection of the actual world, and that therefore it is totally impossible to reconstitute society on the basis of what is merely an embellished shadow of society. In proportion as this shadow takes on substance again, we perceive that this substance, far from being the transfiguration dreamt of, is the actual body of existing society, end quote. Marx. The concept of labor value, putting value and labor on equal footing, that is to say, labor value is the measure of value, would remain common in every socialist critique of capitalism that sought to do without a treatment of class relations. The maximum program of struggle that can be extracted from such premises is that of a, quote, fair price, end quote, for the wage laborer's work, and thus a reform of society that transforms all people into immediate laborers who exchange equal quantities of labor. This is why Lassalle's formula of the payment of the, quote, full fruits of one's labor, end quote, made such headway in the workers' movement, notwithstanding the critique of the Gotha program. I'm not sure, I can't be exactly sure, but I think one of the reasons for the critique of the Gotha program not having greater influence was that I believe, I'm not sure, but Marx and Engels buried it to a certain extent for political reasons. Due to that, because I'm pretty sure it was 1875 that it was written. I think that's when the anti-socialist laws start coming in. So I think the socialist the Social Democratic Party of Germany was facing repression. I'm not sure about that. I might be pulling that out of my ass. So if you know different, leave a comment. Yet even before 1848, Marx had already expounded the great opposing thesis. Labor does not have a price, for the simple reason that labor does not have value. Nothing like the value of labor, in the common sense of the term, exists. There cannot therefore exist a price for something that has no value. If the value of a commodity is given by the quantity of necessary labor contained within it, then what is the value of a working day? The quantity of a day's work. But to say that the value of a working day is given by the quantity of labor contained in a working day is a mere tautology. Quote, value of labor, end quote, does not mean measuring value with the time labored, with the quantity of labor, but rather measuring value with value and labor with labor. It is here that the relationship between antagonistic classes goes awry, for here the individual exchange is reduced to an exchange of labor for labor, and thus to an equal exchange of values. There remains then no fundamental social demand other than equal wages, demanding equal or simply fair pay on the basis of the wage system. This, Marx tells us, is like demanding freedom on the basis of the system of slavery. The honest capitalist dream has always been that of seeing socialism precisely as the realization of capital's ideas. Socialists, before and after Marx, have tried to make this chimera into a practical living reality. The consequence has been the realization of socialism as the ultimate phase of capitalism, a capitalist society made of workers alone, a society under the real power of capital, but without a formal class of capitalists, with capitalism in the relationship of production and socialism in the mode of exchange and distribution, labor exchanged against labor, but for the production of capital, and through capital the extended reproduction of class dominion over the workers. When within capital the single capitalist no longer exists, the capitalist class has truly reached perfection. When the capitalist is no longer distinct from capital, the class dictatorship over the workers is complete. It no longer bears internal contradictions on this point. The working class can no longer locate the working class's adversaries. The workers as a class remain alone and without the possibility of struggle. But one class cannot exist all by itself. There is no class without the struggle against the other class. The working class mediation of capitalist power, a genuine workers' power of capital. This thus remains the only way for the only socialism that is yet come about, namely, the socialism of capital, a system of exploitation made of the exploited alone without exploiters, the dream of the bourgeois socialist honest conscience, now realized. Indeed, Marx noted back in his day that this dream achieves its most perfect expression when it can blend into some rhetorical figure. Quote, free trade for the benefit of the working class, protective duties for the benefit of the working class, prison reform for the benefit of the working class, end quote. Marx. Since the days of the Manifesto, the slogans of, quote, bourgeois socialism, end quote, have changed in form, but the method remains the same. And it will remain the same so long as the organization of the struggle on the workers' side sets out not from what is most necessary, but from what seems most just. Indeed, speaking to the worker representatives in the General Council of the International, Marx advised that, quote, what you think just or equitable is out of the question. The question is, what is necessary and unavoidable within a given system of production, end quote. Marx. That's the end of chapter 3 of Marx, Labor, Power, Working Class by Mario Tronti. Thank you so much for listening.